Next, we're going to identify internal sources of stress. So these are things that happen inside of us. So they are a source of stress that are triggered by our thoughts, our beliefs about something, okay? How we perceive something happening. So these are internal, or how we feel physically, right? If we have a lack of sleep, that's an internal source of stress because our body just doesn't have the energy to approach the situation that in a way we need to, because we're coming from an empty bucket, right? That would be an internal source of stress. And internal sources of stress too can be our actions can also cause that internal, even though it's actions I feel sometimes are external, but our choices of approaching those actions are internal. So let me give you an example. I think a lot of us can relate to this photo of spending hours upon hours upon hours of researching different ways we can support our children. It's important to research and to have that knowledge of how we can best support our children's different needs, challenges, and their development. But when we're doing this into the wee hours of the night, compromising our own sleep in doing this, it can lead to this the next day, where we are feeling tired, exhausted, and we don't have the patience and presence our kids need us to have because we have spent the night on the computer. And this is where we have to start to be mindful of our actions. Another internal source of stress that can happen or a trigger, are traumas that have happened in the past. So things that have caused us to feel a sense of dread or stress or triggered us in the past. When it happens in the future, it can trigger that same emotional response in us. For example, the phone ringing. Early on in my child's educational career, he had a hard time in school, and I would often get calls from the school. And whenever I got a call from the school, it was never saying how well they were never there to talk about how well my child did that day, right? We know that. They were saying something that he did, and I had to go pick him up, right? And literally, for several years, whenever my phone would ring and I would see that it was the school, I would automatically be triggered with this sense of dread, fear, sadness. And so knowing those triggers, it can really help us in those moments to either, change how we perceive that, or, and I did change that trigger actually. As I started, I started to, when the phone rang, I started to think, well, it could be something else. And because when it triggered me and I picked it up in that sense of dread, anger, fear, frustration, all those emotions came, all that energy came in that conversation. But sometimes I would come from a different frame of reference, and it helped me when I faced that trigger. So we will go into that in later modules, but it's good to know how past events can trigger us in the current moment as well. And another internal source of stress. So we have that trauma from past experiences, but we also like symptoms. So like I said before, of not having enough sleep, right? That's an internal trigger, a symptom of feeling exhausted. Or we may be sick. And so that can impact us on what may trigger us and what may not. I know for me, if I'm sick, my patience level is a lot lower than if I'm feeling energetic and I'm not sick, right? I'm sure you can relate to that. So that is an internal source of stress, as well as our state of well-being, our health, any other conditions that we may have. Let's take a quick moment and review our internal sources of stress. One of these internal sources of stress that can make the moment even more challenging can be our thoughts of this situation or during the situation. You're having one of those meetings at school where, unfortunately, you're hearing many of the challenges your child is having. Sometimes where our thoughts can go into many different places of, is my child ever going to get over this? And why does this always have to happen? And what does this teacher think about me? Does she think I'm a bad mom, right? Are all those thoughts helping us to feel better about the situation or worse? So that can be an internal source of stress. Our belief in the moment. So the example of the cable cars, when one son saw the cable car, he believed he was going to have a fantastic time on it. The other child believed it was going to be a very scary situation, event, and he would feel unsafe. So our beliefs in that moment. Unmet expectations. This is definitely a source of stress for our kids. When they expect something to happen and it doesn't, in their mind, they become very upset. Same with us. If we expect something to happen and it doesn't, or expect our kids to do something and it doesn't, that's definitely an internal source of stress or trigger for many of us. There's the looking at the glass half full or half empty, right? How we perceive that moment can either increase the stress we're feeling in that moment or decrease it. Our emotions are an internal source of stress. Remember that emotional well-being spectrum that I had showed you earlier? Well, those emotions in challenging moments that we feel, such as guilt, shame, worry, fear, those are definitely internal sources of stress. And our state of well-being, emotionally, if we're feeling those emotions of guilt, shame, fear, worry, a lot more than those higher level emotions, that's going to be internal source of stress. And mental state of well-being. If we're mentally fatigued because we are always thinking of how to solve the problem and we're never taking time just to allow our mind to be or to think of happy thoughts, mentally, that is also a source of stress if we're just in that state of mental fatigue, and physical too. If we're feeling tired all the time or we're dealing with a physical ailment, this can be a source of stress. And actions and choices. So if we're making actions and choices, we're in actions and making choices that are not supporting our well-being in the moment. And many of us, we do this unconsciously because we're just in the state of doing so often. But some of that doing may not be the best choice in that moment for our overall well-being and can lead to an internal source of stress. And past traumas, things that happen in our past that in the future, when certain things happen, can trigger us and take us back to that emotional trauma that we had in the past. And we will be reliving it in certain events because that trauma is still there. So these are all internal sources of stress. And as we go through this, we're going to talk about how we can approach these internal sources of stress so they are not impacting us in a way that is mounting to our overall level of stress. And we can start to decrease our stress by being aware of these internal sources and how we can change them so they are not a source of stress to the same capacity as they have in the past. Because we have our challenges as parents, and we're definitely going to be faced with difficult moments. So, how can we start to look at other things that are going on in the moment that we can have control of so we can start to make difficult moments less stressful, easier to handle, and we have more confidence and strength in these difficult moments? So, now what I want you to do is I want you to look at your trigger list again and look to see what you feel are internal sources of stress.